Ladies and gentlemen, immature people do this. They turn every disagreement into a personal attack. Instead of listening, they're just waiting for their turn to talk. Instead of seeking truth, they're seeking victory. When someone offers them feedback, they hear an insult. When someone sets a boundary, they see it as betrayal. They make assumptions without asking questions. They judge without knowing the full story. They expect others to read their minds and get offended when people don't. They let their emotions drive the car, then wonder why they keep ending up the wrong place. Immature people play the blame game because taking responsibility feels too heavy. They'd rather point fingers than look in the mirror. They demand respect without giving it. They expect loyalty without earning it. They want the benefits of trust without the work of building it. Immaturity shows in how they handle conflict, either by exploding to prove a point or ghosting to avoid it. They measure relationships by how much people agree with them, not by how much people care enough to tell them the truth. They think winning an argument is more important than keeping a connection. The mark of maturity isn't in age, experience, or title. It's in how you respond when you're challenged, corrected, or misunderstood. And if you're serious about growing, you have to recognize the patterns that keep you from it. Because the truth is, immature people keep repeating the same problems and then blaming the world for giving them the same results. Immature people avoid responsibility by blaming others instead of reflecting on their own actions. This pattern shows up in subtle and obvious ways, from everyday interactions to major life decisions. When things go wrong, they instinctively look outward, searching for someone or something to hold accountable. They rarely pause to ask themselves what part they may have played or how their own choices contributed to the outcome. Instead of owning their mistakes, they create elaborate explanations to shift the spotlight away from their role. This habit can become so ingrained that it feels natural, even justified, as though they are protecting themselves when in reality, they are preventing themselves from growing. Blaming others often provides a temporary sense of relief. It's easier on the ego to point a finger than to look in the mirror. By shifting the fault, immature people avoid the uncomfortable emotions that come with guilt, shame, or regret. But in doing so, they also avoid the very process that leads to learning and maturity. Owning a mistake requires humility, and humility requires strength. Without that strength, they remain stuck in cycles of conflict, misunderstanding, and frustration. They repeat the same patterns because without self-examination, nothing changes. This tendency shows up in relationships when disagreements arise. Instead of hearing a concern as an opportunity to improve, the immature person frames it as an attack. They quickly deflect by pointing out the other person's flaws, often escalating the situation. In the workplace, they may blame colleagues, systems, or circumstances for missed deadlines or poor performance, never considering whether their preparation, time management, or communication played a role. In friendships, they may quietly hold grudges and tell themselves the other person changed or wasn't loyal, when in truth, their own neglect or lack of effort eroded the bond. What's most damaging is that blame without reflection erodes trust. People around them begin to feel unsafe sharing honest feedback, knowing it will likely be twisted or used against them. Instead of fostering environments of growth and understanding, immature people create spaces where silence feels safer than honest. Over time, this isolation reinforces their distorted view that the problem lies everywhere except within. A mature mindset understands that responsibility is not about self-condemnation, but about empowerment. When you take ownership, you take back control. But immature people misunderstand this. They fear that admitting fault will make them look weak, when in truth it builds credibility. They think that by avoiding responsibility they protect their image, but in reality they damage their reputation. Others notice patterns of deflection even if the person doing it refuses to see them. Blaming others also robs them of resilience. Life is unpredictable and challenges are inevitable. Those who habitually externalize their problems remain unprepared to adapt because they never develop the skills to problem solve from within. They're left waiting for external circumstances to improve, for other people to change, or for luck to turn in their favor, all while their own habits remain unchanged. This not only slows personal growth, but also breeds resentment, because the world will never perfectly align to remove all obstacles. Reflection is the missing ingredient. It requires asking questions like what could I have done differently, or what did I overlook? These questions invite uncomfortable truths, but they also create space for change. Immature people resist them because they demand vulnerability, and invulnerability feels like risk. Yet without risk, there is no growth. The irony is that by avoiding the short-term discomfort of accountability, they invite long-term discomfort through repeated mistakes, broken trust, and limited opportunity. Even when the blame they place on others is partially justified, maturity recognizes that shared responsibility still exists. Very few situations are completely one-sided, and even in moments of unfairness, there is often something to learn about one's own boundaries, reactions, or preparation. Immature people overlook this, seeing themselves only as victims or as constant targets of other people's flaws. This keeps them in a state of learned helplessness, convinced that they are powerless to influence outcomes when the opposite is true. Taking responsibility is a choice, but it's one that requires courage. It means being willing to sit with the discomfort of self-awareness and resist the instinct to protect the ego at all costs. It means valuing growth over image and truth over comfort. Immature people, until they learn this, will continue to cycle through the same frustrations, convinced that the problem is always out there somewhere, never realizing that the power to change it starts within themselves. Immature people let emotions control their reactions, rather than responding with reason and self-control. When an emotion surfaces, whether it's anger, frustration, jealousy, or fear, they allow it to dictate their words and actions in the moment. There's no pause to consider the consequences. There's no mental checkpoint to assess if what they're about to say or do will help or hurt the situation. Instead, their reactions spill out raw and unfiltered, often leaving a trail of regret once the emotional high fades. This lack of control doesn't just affect how others see them. It affects how they see themselves, because deep down they often know they acted out of impulse, rather than intention. When emotions take the driver's seat, logic and perspective are pushed to the back. A minor inconvenience can feel like a major offense. A small disagreement can feel like an attack on their character. In this heightened state, every interaction becomes exaggerated, every perceived slight magnified, because there's no filter between feeling and action. They might lash out, make accusations, or say things designed to wound rather than resolve. Once the dust settles, they may attempt to justify their behavior by claiming they were just being honest or speaking their mind, when in truth, they were simply reacting without control. In relationships, this emotional impulsiveness can create instability. A partner might never know which version of the person they're going to get, the calm one or the one ready to erupt. Friends may tread lightly, avoiding certain topics or truths to prevent a blow-up. In professional environments, this behavior can erode credibility as colleagues come to see them as unpredictable or difficult to work with. Opportunities can be lost, not because of a lack of skill, but because of a lack of composure. Letting emotions control reactions also fuels misunderstanding. When you're caught in the grip of a strong feeling, you interpret situations through its lens. Anger can make a harmless comment sound like a personal attack. Jealousy can turn an innocent interaction into a perceived betrayal. Fear can convince you that people are against you when they're not. This skewed perception leads to responses that don't match reality. And the damage often comes not from the original situation, but from the reaction to it. The absence of emotional regulation is a sign of immaturity, because it reflects a lack of self-mastery. Maturity doesn't mean you don't feel intense emotions. It means you have learned how to sit with them, understand them, and choose your response deliberately. Without this skill, emotions become like a storm that knocks down whatever is in its path, including relationships, trust, and opportunities. Immature people often excuse this by claiming it's just the way they are, or that others should accept them unfiltered. But what they overlook is that self-control is not suppression. It's guidance. It's guidance. It's the ability to feel without letting the feeling control the outcome. When you're in the habit of letting emotions rule, you may find yourself constantly apologizing for things said in the heat of the moment. You might notice patterns where the same arguments happen over and over, not because the root issue isn't clear, but because emotional outbursts prevent productive conversation. You might see bridges burned not from deliberate malice, but from moments where impulse overshadowed intent. The cycle becomes exhausting both for the person and for those around them. A lack of self-control also makes it easy for others to manipulate outcomes. People who know how to push your buttons can easily steer your emotions to get a reaction they want. This can be used against you in arguments, negotiations, or personal conflicts. When you're reactive, you give away your power because your decisions are no longer grounded in reason. They're shaped by whatever emotion is dominating in that moment. Developing the ability to respond rather than react requires self-awareness and discipline. And it's learning to pause before speaking, to breathe before acting, to recognize when your feelings are high and your perspective might be clouded. It's not about denying emotions, but about mastering them so that they serve you instead of sabotaging you. Immature people resist this discipline because it requires patience, humility, and a willingness to admit that they don't always handle situations well. The irony is that by clinging to the belief that their emotions justify their actions, they keep themselves stuck in situations that their own reactions make worse. Without learning to manage emotions, a person remains at the mercy of whatever they feel in the moment. They can be led by temporary feelings rather than long-term values, pulled in directions they never intended, and stuck cleaning up messes that could have been avoided with a moment's pause. The cost of emotional impulsiveness is high. Relationships strained, trust broken, reputations damaged, and yet the root cause often comes down to a choice they have not yet learned to make. The choice to control the response rather than be controlled by the emotion. Immaturity is not a permanent condition. It's a stage that many stay in because they refuse to face themselves. Avoiding responsibility and letting emotions run unchecked may feel easier in the moment, but they carry long-term costs that can't be ignored. The more someone points fingers outward, the less they grow inward. The more they react from impulse, the more they sabotage the very connections and opportunities they claim to want. Maturity demands a shift from blaming to owning, from reacting to responding, from being led by ego to being guided by wisdom. True growth begins when a person chooses to pause, reflect, and take responsibility before assigning fault. It begins when they understand that emotions are signals, not commands, and that self-control is not weakness, but strength. The ability to own your actions and regulate your reactions is what transforms situations, repairs relationships, and builds trust. Without these qualities, immaturity remains in control, but with them a person steps into the kind of stability, respect, and influence that only maturity can.